Amen is right. Good morning, church. Great to be with you this morning. Wow, what a video. I mean, that just really got me inspired here and thinking. I do remember as a kid, I knew the strategic routes to the right adult classrooms to get the donuts. And so many memories just come back to me from that. I do like videos like that because we're a big church and they really help us to have almost like we all have an inside joke together now. We can just move forward and we know what happened today with that video. I'm always looking for ways to take my preaching to the next level. And towards the end of that video, I thought, that's it. If I could just rappel from the rafters here, that would probably be the best way to take it to the next level. Kids, you guys did a great job on that. In fact, it's funny, I don't know if you kids or anybody knows this, my earliest memory of fasting is directly connected to donuts. So the first time I ever fasted, I was probably too young. I was 16 years old, and we were about to go on a mission trip, and Jeff McMillan, the youth minister, said, we're going to fast and pray for this trip. And it was a long fast. It was a 30-hour fast. So we fasted. I don't remember praying very much, but at the end of the fast, we all got together to break the fast, and here is how I broke my fast. I ate not one, not two, but 6 Krispy Kreme donuts to break my fast. No, that's not what you should do. If you're fasting today, do not do that. This did a number on my system, so don't do that. Anyway, I have great memories of fasting and donuts. If you are fasting today, way to go. It is hard, but it is a very good thing to do. So we're tracking through the Sermon on the Mount, and in just a minute we're going to be in chapter 7. A little pop quiz as we begin. I want you to try to name the top 3 best-selling musical artists of all time. So think what they might be. You can guess to your neighbor, who do you think is number 3 on the list? Number 3 is Michael Jackson. Okay, number 2, you got to guess to your neighbor. You can say it out loud. What do you think it is? It's Elvis. And then number 1, anybody know it? The Beatles. So if you are 30 years old or older, this probably does not surprise you, this list. But if you're a child, teenager, you might think, what? These people are old, out of date. How could they be the best-selling musicians of all time? In fact, if you were to just pay attention to current culture, current media coverage, who would you guess if you just looked at today? Who do you think the number 1 artist would be? It'd be Taylor Swift. Do you know where she falls on the list? Number 12 of all time. So it's really interesting when you're in the middle of one cultural phenomenon, sometimes you lose track of the fact that it's just one cultural phenomenon amongst dozens. And as the decades go by, every famous person simply becomes one peak of an enormous mountain range. And it's interesting to think that there's a 6-year-old out there right now who can't barely sing at all, but here in about 12, 15 years, he or she will sing some song and the world will then come and bow down at this person's feet and worship them for being the next big thing. That's just how it works. It's the same thing with sports. There's a toddler somewhere in the world right now that can barely throw a ball across his bedroom, but here in 15 years, 20 years, he will sign a $1 billion contract to throw a ball on a field, and we will rally around this person. We'll be interested around this person. We will talk about this person. We'll be so frustrated when his or her team loses. That's simply the nature of the world today. So here's the question I'm interested in today. How do we evaluate the people that influence us? It's no secret that we are all swept away by celebrities and actors and influencers and YouTubers and authors. And yet sometimes it's hard to know, how do you be a fan of somebody in a spiritually healthy sense. Or another way of putting this is, what does following an influencer look like when you're following Jesus? Like, how do you do this well? Because most people don't really think about it. They just find someone they're attracted to, that they like, and they just follow that person. And they buy everything the person sells, and they believe everything the person says. But if you're a follower of Jesus, perhaps there should be some different way you think about these things. So when I was growing up, I grew up in the 90s, and so I was a huge Michael Jordan fan. Collected the cards. My bedroom was a lot of red and black Chicago Bulls everywhere. And I know all the stats. I know the flu game, the shot, the shrug. I can argue all day long at the MJ versus LeBron debate, getting into like deep analytical statistics with like PER and wins above replacement player and all sorts of that kind of stuff. So I'm a big Michael Jordan fan. I still am. In the pandemic, I watched The Last Dance, which was a documentary about his final season with the Bulls, and also went into a lot of his career. And it was really interesting watching that documentary because I saw him in a slightly different light. Still an amazing basketball player, but it struck me more than it ever had that there are many parts of his behavior and many parts of his attitude which are very counter to the way of Jesus. There are times, and there have been times in Jordan's life, where he is vindictive, cruel, hateful, cares a lot more about winning than people. And so while I still appreciate his skills as a basketball player, I have a little bit different view of him as a person. Now, why is that? Well, part of the reason is I have a more mature filter by which I can view things as an adult compared to when I was 13 years old. And so as a disciple of Jesus, how are we supposed to evaluate these people who influence us? Well, here's what Jesus has to say on this topic. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, verse 15. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. So first of all, this is a warning. Jesus is simply saying this is going to happen, and you have to be on the lookout for it. There will be people come into your life, and they will be nice and kind people. That's the sheep's clothing part. But beneath that exterior, there will be this toxicity in them. They will be very immoral people. They will badly influence you, but you won't know that because they will come dressed like a sheep, and you won't know that they're a wolf until later on. So one of the really interesting points of this text is that evil rarely presents itself as evil. In fact, in other places in the New Testament, we read that Satan masquerades as an angel of light. So as Christians, we are to be in the business of discerning what is good and what is evil. And the challenge here is that you're not going to discern evil because evil is going to tell you about it. Like, evil will never just come into your life and say, this is who I am. No one's going to come to you and say, come and follow me and I will make you fishers of sin. I'll teach you how to be cruel to your sister. And I'll teach you how to worship your money and to have an affair. Evil does not present itself as evil. It always presents itself as good. And so the truth of this text is that Jesus is advocating that we practice discernment when it comes to content intake. So you think about, like back then, where they would get content, there wasn't a lot of places. Like you might walk to the market one day and you overhear this teacher saying something. Oh, that's an interesting perspective. So you go home and you tell your family and friends about it. That's like where they would hear interesting ideas. Or maybe you have a friend who's repeating something that they heard in the market someday. Like that's how they received content. And in that day, Jesus is saying, you got to be really careful. Got to pay attention here. Be discerning about what you hear. So imagine what he would say in our day. I mean, think about the evolution of content intake. I've done entire, not just sermons, but series on the information overload that we find ourselves in today. In fact, over all the years and the books I've read and research I've done on this subject, there's one particular sentence from one particular book that's always stuck with me. It's called the book is called The Art of Stillness. The author is Pico Iyer, and he says anyone reading this book will take in as much information today as Shakespeare did in his lifetime. It's amazing how many messages we hear, how much information we take in a given day. And if we're not discerning, if we have no criteria for evaluation of how do we know what to hold and what to let go of, we will be extremely influenced by culture, by people, sometimes in ways that we don't want to be influenced by. In fact, if you think about it, the average person, if they've never given one thought to their content intake, the average person then has about 2 questions that they normally would ask themselves to decide whether or not to listen to something. And they're very simple questions. Question number 1 is, does this entertain me? And question number 2 is, does this agree with me? And if the answers to those questions are yes, then we're probably going to listen to it. So does this make me laugh? Is it interesting? Can I pass time quickly by watching this show or listening to this person? Well, if the answer is yes, I'm probably going to watch it. And does this person's belief system, do their opinions match up with mine? And again, if the answer is yes, then we're probably going to watch that person. And so I'm not saying that these are the only questions, and I'm not saying that everybody only asks these 2, but I am saying if you've never given critical thought to it, then these will be your default questions. And so yet in this text we read, verse 16 again, by their fruit, you will recognize them. So what's Jesus really doing in this section? Well, first of all, it is a warning. He's just saying, watch out. But second of all, he's giving us a different set of criteria. Here's the kinds of questions that you should ask about people or potential influencers. And he begins his discussion with fruit. So let's talk about fruit for a minute. We have a different relationship with fruit today than people did 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, fruit came from trees and bushes and vines. Today, fruit comes from the grocery store. And so we don't really think about where it came from. Obviously, it still comes from vines and trees, but for most of us, our experience is we just go to the produce section and pick out the fruit. And yet in Jesus' day, there was still such this connection between the actual vine that fruit came from and the piece of fruit. So today, most fruit is grown on these massive farms, and they have climate-controlled systems, and it's a mass production, and so that they all look the same. And so we don't have a whole lot of rotten bananas or apples, and if we do, it's just because you left it out too long. But in Jesus' day, if you ate a bad apple, then it probably came from a diseased tree. And so the point here that Jesus is making is you've got to pay attention to the person's life. What kind of fruit are they producing? On one level, you can just listen to what they say. Sure, you can know a little bit about a person, but you really have to pay attention to the kind of life that they are living. In fact, the next section of the Sermon on the Mount explains even more what kind of life this should be. So these 2 sections in the Sermon on the Mount are very connected. You've got false teachers and then false disciples back to back. So here's what this next section says. Verse 21, not everyone who says to me, by the way, this is such a indicting section of the Sermon on the Mount. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. That's a really important phrase there. Only the one who does the will of my Father. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evil doers. So who should we listen to? It's not those who speak good words. It's those who do God's will. It's those who actually do the will of the Father. Now, what exactly is that? Well, that phrase, the will of God, appears all over the New Testament, and each time it appears, you want to pay attention to the context to know what it means in that text. Well, in our text, this is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. This section about false disciples leads right into the wise and the foolish builders. And so when Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount by saying, those who do the will of God are the ones that are pleasing to God, then what he means is that the will of God is what he's just said in the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, at the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, you find the Lord's Prayer. In the middle of the Lord's Prayer, you find the line, may your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so the point here is that the people you should listen to are those who are actually practicing the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. So with that in mind, here are 3 tests, 3 litmus tests that you can take and you can put on other people when you're trying to evaluate, should I listen to this? Should I watch this show? Should I listen to this podcast? Should I be influenced by this YouTuber? Here's 3 tests that you can give. First one is this, the adversary test. How does this person speak about their adversaries? So this is directly Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies. So I remember when I was in grad school, getting my master's in Bible, and there was this professor that some of my classmates liked to make fun of. And you need to know that students in grad school for Bible, it's really, really easy to be self-righteous. It just kind of goes with the territory. You're reading all these scholars, and you're trained to look at people's work with skepticism, and you're trained to really critique. You have to critique your peers, you have to critique everything. And so it's just really easy to have this slightly pompous, a little bit arrogant, a little bit self-righteous feel when you're in grad school. So some of my classmates have this professor, and they're always dogging this professor. He's out of touch. He's narrow-minded. He's not relevant anymore. Well, I remember walking down the hallway one day, and I was with this preacher. He's about 15 years older than me, and this professor's he came up, and so I asked this preacher. I says, "What do you think about this professor?" And I'll never forget what this guy said to me. He says, "You know, that man's been following Jesus a lot longer than me, and so I'm honored to sit at his feet and learn from him." And I was so struck by that answer because this preacher, I'm friends with this guy, and I know for a fact that he has disagreements with this professor. But the way he spoke about him with dignity and honor when he didn't have to, that's always stuck with me. And it makes me want to listen to this man more. So you might ask yourself, the people that you listen to the most, how do they talk about the people they disagree with? How do they talk about their adversaries? Do they always get fired up? Oh, I can't believe she said this. I can't believe he did this. And what? She's a da-da-da-da-da. If that's how your favorite speakers and influencers talk about their adversaries, is that the will of God? Is that the teaching of Jesus? Is that what we read in the Sermon on the Mount? No, it's not. And so one question to ask yourself when you're trying to figure out who to listen to and how deeply to let their words sink into your heart is, how does this person talk about their adversaries? Here's test number 2. It's the proximity test. How do the people who are closest to this person do? So when you think about this, whoever your influencer is, I want you to think about their closest friends. Or if they have children, think about their children. Or if they're married, think about their spouse. How are those people in this person's life doing? In a lot of ways, your you can think about your first half of discipleship as getting your life together, working on yourself. The second half of discipleship is making the other people around you better. So in many ways, you and I are just like Adam and Eve at the beginning of time, called to cultivate the garden. The people around you in your life is your garden. And so sure, it's fine if you're doing great, but if the people around you are not flourishing, well, that says a lot about the fruit you're producing. Anyone can entertain somebody else, but to practice faithfulness over time is a different story. Anybody can make a point. Very few people can make a difference. And so when you look at the people that influence you, pay attention to their garden. How are the people closest to them doing? I was talking to a guy the other day his boss just changed. And he said, it's amazing what's happened to my work environment because the leader is just so much better. And the way that this boss conducts their business makes everybody on the team flourish. So how are the people in this person's life doing? In fact, if you're like in a point in your life where you're about to transition to something or have something new on the horizon and you're looking for advice, let me just make a comment here. So if you're about to have a child, or if you're about to get married, or if you're about to change jobs, or if you're about to retire, or if you're wanting your life with Christ to just go a little bit deeper, you'll find a lot of people will give you advice because people like to talk and people like to be helpful. But the best thing you can do is to go find someone that's doing it. Go find someone that's in retirement and doing well. Go find the couple that's been married for 50 years and doing well, and ask that person. Don't just listen to the person that's speaking. Listen to the person that's actually doing it and has built the garden around them. A friend of mine just last week was telling me, so he got to work for one of the most influential YouTubers on the planet. So this guy doesn't have thousands of subscribers. This guy has millions of subscribers. And I've watched his videos. They're highly entertaining. But this friend of mine was telling me that behind the scenes, this YouTuber is completely toxic. He's cruel to the people that work for him, treats them like garbage, speaks harshly to people, long hours, little pay. In fact, my friend was telling me that another guy was a few years ago looking forward to going home to visit his family for Thanksgiving because they had been off on this long shoot, and this really popular YouTuber said, no, I need you to fly to such and such place because you gotta get this video done. So it's really interesting that this guy can produce some of the most entertaining videos that anybody's ever seen, but behind the scenes, he's not producing a healthy garden. So ask yourself the proximity question. Is this person that's influencing me, how is their garden? So question 3, I want to go back to the text, or test number 3. Remember, Jesus says this, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? This text is really convicting to me. Because these people that Jesus is talking about have performed miracles, whatever that, maybe it's healings. They've performed exorcisms, and they've prophesied, which in this context just means they've preached. And Jesus is not impressed with these people. Now, why wouldn't Jesus be impressed with these people? As I read the text, I believe the reason Jesus is not impressed is this. Jesus is more impressed with your character than your performance. In fact, that's the third test. It's the character test. Who is this person when they're not performing? Who is this person when they are not in the spotlight? So the reason this text is very challenging to me is because I'm a preacher. And I spend so much time in the Word trying to figure out helpful ways to speak things to you because I do care about you and I love you, but I'm also aware of the irony here, which is I'm giving a sermon on a text, and the point is that, Phil, your sermons mean diddly squat compared to your life and your character. And so there's a weight that I feel when I write a message like this. And I do want you to know that my preparation in sermons is formative. So some of you joke with me sometimes, oh, you stepped on my toes today, Phil. I do want you to know that my toes are stepped on first. My prep for these messages does highly influence me. And I'm not perfect, but I try to the best of my ability to actually follow these words that I am speaking to you. So the character test is, who is this person when they're not performing? I got the flu 2 weeks ago. I'm sitting on my couch. I had one of those days I'm just all day long sick, can't move. And so I watched the documentary on Amazon Prime, Jonathan and Jesus. It follows the main actor for The Chosen, who plays Jesus. He travels the world and he talks to all these famous people that know a lot about Jesus. Well, I was delighted because in one of the episodes, Philip Yancey comes onto the screen and has these profound insights about Jesus, a lot of them from his book, The Jesus I Never Knew. And I was watching this thing, and this is so cool that this guy is so relevant. He's written all these books. They've sold millions of copies, and he's going to be at Memorial Road in just a few months. Well, last week a few of us had our first Zoom meeting to work out some of the logistics of his visit. And to be honest, I was slightly nervous going into that meeting because I thought, I really appreciate this man. His books have been really helpful to me. If behind the scenes he's a jerk, that's really going to frustrate me. I was delighted by this short Zoom call because I realized that Dr. Yancey is a man of character. He was kind, he was gracious, he was down to earth. You would never have guessed based on the Zoom call that he's a famous author. In fact, towards the end of the call, he said two things that really stuck out to me. One is, as we were talking about some of the details of lodging, he wanted to make sure that we knew his wife was coming, and he really wanted her to be taken care of as well. And I thought, that's so cool. He's thinking about his wife. And then the second thing he said at the end that really stuck out to me is he said, he asked a question to Andy. He said, Andy, would you mind sending me some of the ways that your particular congregation is involved in the community, because I'd like to highlight some of the strengths of your church during my presentation. I thought that is so thoughtful. So yes, he can be interesting, he can be compelling, but he also passes the character test. So as you think about the people that influence you, adversary test, how do they speak about their enemies? Proximity test, how's the garden around them growing? And then the character test, who are they when they are not in front of the spotlight? Final thing I'll say in this message is this, a little bit of a twist. The whole message has been about you asking other people these questions. But it's also really important to let the questions come to yourself too. How do you talk about your enemies and your irritants, just the people that frustrate you? How do you speak about them? How's your garden doing? How are the people in your life doing? And then what are you like when nobody else is watching? So we're going to sing one of the most famous hymns of all time, Amazing Grace. And there's a lot of things that happen during this time. And in fact, this time when we sing this song is one of the most significant times in our worship service. I want to give you a heads up. In 2 weeks, we're going to have an addition to this time of invitation that we think is going to be a blessing to you. So I want to give you a heads up. 2 weeks, I'm going to tell you something that's going to happen during this time. But what we do in this time is we sing, we worship, we let the words of Scripture percolate in our hearts. I think that the song after the sermon is a time where God can start to plant truth deeply into the heart. So I'd like you to worship while we sing Amazing Grace. It's also a time where there are moments when people have an encounter with the Lord and they need to do something about it in real time, either through getting baptized or through asking the church to pray for them. And that's always a time when we can celebrate or pray with people. And so we do want to give you that chance this morning. So if you do need to pray with someone, you can come here, make your way up to the front, or if you'd like to get baptized, you can come talk to me about that as well. Let's stand and sing.